Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this really exciting talk. My name is Angie Bautista Chavez. I am a postdoctoral fellow here at ASU. Thank you for joining us here at the Center for Latinos and Latinas in American Politics Research. I'm really excited today to introduce our speaker, David Cortez. He's coming to us from Notre Dame. And I will just briefly introduce David, and then we will give him anywhere from 30 to 45 minutes, have him present his work, and then we will conclude with the Q&A. So David Cortez is an assistant professor of political science at Latinx studies at the University of Notre Dame. David Cortez is, Cortez's research centers on ethnic and racial identity, with a particular focus on intersectional and situational identity salience. His current book project explores the emergence of a disproportionately Latinx immigration law enforcement workforce as a metaphor for the minority experience in the United States. Drawing on extensive fieldwork, including interviews with and observations of more than 100 immigration and customs enforcement agents across Texas, Arizona, and California, his research engages questions of belonging, obligation, and liminality. His research has been supported by the National Science Foundation and has published in the Annual Review of Sociology and Political Science quarterly. And this is a very special day for me because I have long admired David's work. I am very excited to engage with his project that is in the works. The project is titled Broken Mirrors, Latinx, La Migra, and the Conflict of Being Both. And with that, I'll let David take it over.
Thank you so much, Angie. It's such a pleasure to be here with you all today and to be invited here to begin with to share what is actually an offshoot from the book project. It's an article length manuscript that I've been prepping for a while now, almost a year, although year in COVID time, so it doesn't necessarily feel like a year. But it's called Becoming the State, Immigration Control and the Weaponization of Brown Bodies. And so I look forward to your comments and your suggestions because, like I said, this is still in development. And so I'm still trying to work through the particular kind of elements of the broader narrative of the piece and trying to leverage the best evidence that I have for addressing the question at the root of it. So I'll go ahead and get started. So today, more than any period in history, the front lines of federal immigration law enforcement agencies reflect the demographics of the populations they police. Across the agencies charged with immigration law enforcement, namely Border Patrol and ICE, Latinos are overrepresented relative to their proportion of both the overall federal workforce and the general population. With immigration and customs enforcement and removal operations, ICE ERO, what we typically think of when we think of ICE, at nearly 30% Latino and Border Patrol nearly 50%. What was once an exclusively white enterprise and viewed for much of the 20th century as a foreign occupying force in border communities and referred to sometimes pejoratively as La Migra, the last 40 to 45 years or so have witnessed the emergence of a much different immigration law enforcement workforce, what I've taken to calling the new Latino Migra. Now, it's important to note that what's most fascinating about this demographic shift is that it's taken place in the context that it has, amidst a historically problematic relationship between Latino communities and immigration law enforcement agencies. A relationship marred by violence and intimidation in which such agencies have never solely policed migration specifically, but instead indiscriminately blanketed Latino communities in a shroud of surveillance, policing, and battlefield technology. Consider, for instance, the dirigible drones you see here hovering over communities in my home of South Texas. Now, it's important to note that these pictures weren't taken 20 or 30 years ago, but within the last 5. I highlight this point specifically to demonstrate the fact that despite the emergence of a less ethnically and racially homogenous immigration law enforcement workforce, The new Latino migra of today finds itself the stewards of a long-standing, but more importantly, ongoing racial project that continues to tie Latino identity to criminality and violently relegate Latinos in the communities in which they live to a perpetual state of otherness. In this light, the emergence of a disproportionately Latino migra presents something of a puzzle, right? And if you're asking yourself, wait, how do we make sense of this? Rest assured that you're not alone. In fact, in the last 20 or so years, scholars have made considerable efforts to understand how Latino agents interact with ostensibly co-ethnic clientele, how they understand their institutional roles, and how they understand themselves. Each of these studies, however, centered on a primary question of, do Latino agents' ethnic identities matter? If not, maybe with the presumption that don't they matter? As you can imagine, these studies have kind of broken off into two camps, between those that would say that who Latinos are is unlikely to influence the way that they conduct themselves as immigration agents, and others who suggest that their ethnic identities do matter. As laudable as this work is, however, and of course I get to say that because my name's in there too, there's something missing. And it's rooted in the fact that identity in all of these pieces is treated as a primarily psychological phenomenon of self-categorization, kind of in line with social identity theory. But obscured in this is the role of physical outward expressions of identity. What I call with shorthand, Latino agents' brown bodies. And I'll expand on what I mean by that in just a few minutes. This leads me to the question of what role, if any, do physical outward expressions of the ethnic identities of Latino immigration agents or their brown bodies play in immigration control and the enactment of state violence? And moreover, what does this actually look like? As I mentioned, most of the previous studies have focused on the extent to which Latino agents identify ethnically and the extent to which that actually shapes the way they behave. But no one, to this point, outside of one small reference, has actually acknowledged that no matter how Latino agents might identify individually, they wear their identities on their persons. My central argument in this piece, and what I hope I'll present sufficient evidence to that effect, is that irrespective of self-identification, Latino agents' physical identities, their literal bodies, matter. And the state weaponizes them for essential work, including accessing communities, slipping through or blending into crowds, and literally opening doors. So to that end, the rest of the talk is going to proceed as follows. I'm going to step back a little bit and walk us through some of the previous studies and their treatment of identity before moving on to the theoretical underpinnings that hold this project together, and then moving on to a discussion about my data and methodology, how I went about actually collecting data for this. I'm obviously really excited to talk to you all about that. Then before moving on to my findings, discussing the implications of those findings, and then of course opening the floor up to questions. And I hope some suggestions on how whether or not this framing works for you all, and tips you might have on how to kind of, again, leverage the evidence in a way that helps me communicate this in what I hope will be an article length manuscript. You'll see why I'm saying that specifically in just a bit. So, as I mentioned, previous studies of Latino immigration law enforcement agencies, while not necessarily few and far between, are pretty tightly compacted with respect to the way that identity is conceptualized. And that is that it's conceptualized, as I mentioned previously, as a primarily psychological phenomenon. Scholars previously have argued that to understand the Latino immigration agent, we have to look at them as they see themselves in encounters with co-ethnic migrants, not as Latinos, but as citizens, insiders, soldiers, and/or state agents. That it's these identities that are more important in understanding encounters between agent and migrant than any other. Others, leveraging social identity theory, have argued that ethnic identities may become salient in the course of those interactions with co-ethnic migrants and go on to shape their behavior. This is my work included here, right? That it is impossible at times for some of these people to completely disassociate themselves from their self-identification of being ethnically Latino. But again, this is primarily psychological. And obviously, while psychological self-categorization is admittedly a major part of identity, it is definitely not alone. In fact, identity can also be physical. I don't think I have to explain that this is the case, and expressed outwardly without much control, right? The way that I look is the way that I look. My mother may have told me to stay out of the sun and not play so much outside during the middle of the day so that I didn't darken my skin, which, yeah, that's super loaded. But there's very little that I can control about how my body communicates or what my body communicates about my group membership to others. Via what scholars refer to as descent-based attributes, essentially, including, quote, attributes acquired genetically, including skin color, gender, hair type, eye color, height, and physical features, through cultural and historical inheritance, including your name, your language, your place of birth, and origin of one's parents or ancestors, or in the course of one's lifetime, right? Their last name or perhaps tribal markings. As Chandra actually teaches us, descent-based attributes are visible, right? Immediately displayed on one's person. But what's most important here is recognition of the fact that while individuals may opt out of self-identified group membership, right? They might say, well, I'm an American first and foremost, or in the case of previous scholarship on Latinos and immigration, I'm a citizen and that's what matters to me. I'm a federal law enforcement agent and that is the identity that matters most to me psychologically. That descent-based attributes, the skin color, hair type, eye color, and physical features or physical markers of group membership are not as easily jettisoned. To borrow again from Chandra, they're stickier. So why might we think that these identities might matter? And why might we think that they've been weaponized in essence by the state? Well, the American state has amassed a wealth of weapons for controlling migration, from border militarization to interior enforcement and remote control. Beyond this, the state has co-opted the desert to do, as Jason De Leon puts it, the dirty work of migration control. In this last case, the state has literally weaponized ecology against migrants it wishes to deter. So why not the brown bodies of Latino agents is the question that I'm asking. And in fact, history tells us that we shouldn't expect any different of a story when it comes to Latino agents, because brown bodies have always been essential to the enactment of state violence. From La Lengua of Cortez to the Central Intelligence Agency of today, descent-based attributes have been weaponized continuously in service of state power. Former CIA Director John Brennan was actually quoted as saying, as he launched a campaign to optimize diversity within the agency, that such diversity would, quote, facilitate secret missions in countries where minorities go unnoticed. Within the realm of immigration law enforcement, actually, there's evidence to suggest the weaponization of brown bodies was always the goal. In a dispatch from a Brownsville, Texas sector chief of Border Patrol in 1924, in a report of the Secretary of Labor, he stated the district has been promised an increased patrol force, and if the number of men asked for is given, end quote, they are men who have a thorough knowledge of the Spanish language and Mexican border conditions, and despite me not knowing what this means necessarily, are temperamentally fitted for this particular type of work, and proper transportation facilities can be furnished, it is believed that the smuggling situation in the district can be effectually controlled. Informed by this, the argument that I make here is that there's something actually somewhat nefarious, which is tough to prove, obviously, but there's something actually insidious about the incorporation of Latinos in the work of immigration law enforcement. Greg Prieto actually says and has discussed the incorporation of Latinos in the work of immigration law enforcement as a shield against claims of racism and racial profiling, right? Where because there's Latinos among the immigration law enforcement workforce, that means that the agency couldn't possibly be engaged in racism or racial profiling. But Latino agents' physical identities actually do more than work as a shield or cloak, as it were, for the state. What I'm arguing here is that they're another weapon in an ongoing war on immigration, in line with the weapon of the desert, in line with interior enforcement operations, in line with remote control. Because embodied in Latinos, the state not only gains access to, but effectively disarms the communities it wishes to expel. So to evaluate this, to actually uncover it and test it, whether or not this is actually happening, I employed a qualitative methodological approach. And the purpose behind this was to get at questions that I might not be able to get at with a survey, A, but B, obviously I'm dealing with a hidden population here, so there was no way that I could actually, randomly sample the people that do this work. But most importantly, I wanted to be able to spend time with the people engaged in this kind of work and engage in deep conversations about what it is that they do, how they see themselves, how they see their role in immigration law enforcement, and to get a sense of their connections to their ethnic identity, and the extent to which that shapes the way they approach their jobs. That meant spending 13 months in the field between November 2014 and December 2015, and utilizing multiple entry snowball sampling, I was able to conduct interviews with 100 ICE ERO agents across Arizona, California, and Texas with an oversampling of Latinos. 61 of the agents were Latino and 39 non. These interviews were conducted in field offices, agents' homes, restaurants, coffee shops, and bars. And if you're wondering if the social lubricant of alcohol in those bars made conversations tense or made some agents speak more freely than others, I actually didn't notice much of a difference. When agents were candid with me, they were candid. And when they weren't, when they were somewhat monosyllabic in their responses, that was who they were. These interviews averaged about 74 minutes in length and were semi-structured for comparison across these cases. To date, this is the largest and most diverse study of immigration law enforcement agents ever conducted. It's something I'm really proud about and of course happy to talk more about in Q&A. So what does the data actually look like? And here's a sense of the demographic overview of, at least within the confines of this talk, of the Latino agents in the sample, right, or in the group of cases, which is a total of 61. And what I want to point out immediately is that, despite the fact that this wasn't random sampling, the cases actually, as a group, approach some semblance of representativeness with respect to the agency overall. But of course, I wouldn't be so bold as to draw any generalizable conclusions out of here. So again, what it is that I'm arguing is that outside of the way that Latino immigration agents might see themselves, right? The extent to which they identify as Latino, identify in ethnic terms, that the bodies that they wear actually do a lot of communication about their group membership for them. Friends have actually referred to this, this project, this paper, as a case of when descriptive representation goes wrong. And so what I want to do right now is highlight for you what this actually looks like on the ground. And it begins with a simple discussion on the part of some of these agents about how important it is to have Latinos in these positions and what the advantage they see is between having Latinos in them versus non-Latinos, and a term that agents used rather often, Anglo agents. It begins with Victoria Martinez actually immediately saying the Anglo agent, at least here in the southern border, is frankly useless. She didn't mince words very well, but she was speaking precisely to the fact that there was something specifically about the way that Latino agents are able to work in immigration law enforcement that Anglo agents didn't have. Sylvia Newman actually backed this up and said that the problem for non-Latino agents was this cultural barrier, because it's just like a lack of trust, she called it. You definitely feel more comfortable with someone that's relatable. Speaking on behalf of migrants that she no doubt encounters in her daily work, and claiming in essence that migrants are more likely to talk to her than they are, or at least more likely to open up and relate to her than they would be with someone who is not Latino. Carlos Ortegon actually expanded on this, right? Speaking exactly to what the situation might be like for a non-Latino agent. He says, because we're dealing with these Hispanics every day, and it's better to talk to them in their language so they understand what's going on. When you go and arrest someone, and the family, the mom wants to know what's going on, and the white guy is like, no hablo, like, how would you feel? Arturo Cepeda actually, continued down this line, says sometimes migrants will talk to an agent that doesn't speak Spanish or that's from another ethnicity, and they won't open up to them as much as they open up to me. They don't want to speak to somebody that doesn't speak Spanish. They've told me, oh, he doesn't speak Spanish, I don't want to talk to him. Now, by this point, you might be asking yourself, so is this just about service provision, right? An ability to communicate. And this outward expression of agents' ethnic identities through language is actually just not necessarily weaponized, but it's a perk, right, of having a diverse workforce, a representative bureaucracy, so to speak. But it's deeper than that, or at least I want to show you that it's deeper than that. Valerie Elizondo spoke to this specifically, saying how the language itself makes them a commodity because it furthers the goals of the institution, of the agency itself. I was doing the knock and talks, Ted Sandoval said, going in, native Spanish speaker, of course, very braggadociously. You're going to want to have somebody like that than somebody who doesn't habla español, as he mocked poor pronunciation, There's an element here of bragging about the fact that, or not necessarily bragging, but being boastful about the fact that he brings something to the table and furthers the mission of the agency than anybody else could. Cesar Cardenas actually referenced this and does the comparison between a non-Latino agent and a Latino agent. He says, I've seen it where our true Anglo agents, their Spanish is very, very choppy. It's not very, it's very poor. So they'll try to talk to an alien in their chopped up Spanish, and the alien will like blow them off. The aliens just blow them off and not pay attention to them. And then the Hispanic dude could follow up and ask the question, and oh yeah, she's gonna answer you, or he's gonna answer. Chris De Leon spoke also to this notion of being a commodity. Here it's growing. Yeah, there's a lot of, we certainly have more Hispanics than other agencies. speaking to an operation that he was on the day before. He said, with the other agencies, you hardly see any Hispanic people. We're a hot commodity. Here, a lot of people don't speak Spanish. Other agencies request our assistance. You speak Spanish. Again, this is agents' ethnic outward expressions of their ethnic identities, putting them in a position of importance within the agency. And this is where we see it actually start to shift into the tactical advantage of the language element of this. The academy has instructors, and those instructors, they know the Spanish language, but the proper language of Mexico, the proper language, okay, which is not the language that is used in immigration. Up here in immigration, you use the street language, the Pachuco language, the Vayuco language, which is different than the others. Again, all agents within ICE and Border Patrol receive the same training. The Latino agents receive Spanish training and the non-Latino agents do. So this is more than just about Spanish by itself, more than just about representative service distribution, if you will. It's more than just about being representative of their quote unquote clientele. There's something specific about the Spanish as it's spoken through a brown body. Angel Lattes speaks to this and speaks to the fact that it's more actually than just the Spanish. And here's where we start getting into the physical bodies, right? Oh, definitely. For one, the language, as he's talking about the advantages that he might have. And right off the bat, that takes half or more of your problems. I've seen people that don't know. In a simple, what could be a friendly interaction with a detainee or a criminal, whatever you want to call it, becomes a frustrating thing. For us, we have a lot of criminals that just knowing the slang, knowing the jokes, we make it go smooth because we're in close quarters. They become very cooperative because they know to a certain degree that we probably come from the same descendants. It opens up that communication. Enforcing, hell, if me and you, acknowledging me in the conversation, both go on surveillance, we'll blend right in. So that's also a positive. I would say you might have more compassion, but I found that a lot of Hispanic descendants, they tend to be the most assholes. When I asked Elias if he thought that his ethnic identity, the way that he looked, changed the way that he was able to do the job, he said, I think it would apply and help out once they get into the field, or once I get into the field. You know how to possibly blend in. And I said, so people don't know that you're a law enforcement officer at first? And he said, yeah, look at me. Referencing the fact that despite the way that he might particularly identify, which he specifically identifies as an American, to him, his body actually allows him to blend in. Rosie Acevedo actually spoke to this very same thing. In her case, she brings gender into it as well, right? Another descent-based or ascriptive trait. They expect more like, it's going to sound very stereotypical, but a white male to be doing immigration work, not so much a Mexican or Hispanic female. Like the people when you're going out doing knock and talks or doing tag and baggages or whatever. So when you surprise them, it's kind of like, she's an agent. I just ID'd myself to an agent. And it's like, so sorry, but you're being detained. Again, talking about how the fact that the way that she looks actually almost disguises the fact that she's an agent to the migrants that she encounters. Gustavo Argenal was talking about this very same thing. And again, like a lot of the agents did, tried to rope me into the discussion, probably because of the way that I look. But he said, I don't know if maybe it's a tactic they're using, the agency, he's saying, so that maybe we're more relatable to the people we're apprehending. I really don't know what their goal is with that. I don't know. Maybe they're just trying to put a friendlier face on a uniform. A lot of these people that are coming in their head, they're probably thinking tall white guy, blue eyes is going to apprehend them. So when they actually get apprehended by, David Cortez, it's kind of like, I wasn't expecting this. Elizabeth Armenta spoke to the fact that she was doing undercover work and had fooled enough people to think that she wasn't an ICE agent, saying I was actually doing a field operation. We came across this person. We kind of did a little bit of undercover work to try to find this person. And when we finally put handcuffs on him, the girl comes out. One of his coworkers comes out and in Spanish tells me, "Que mala. How can you do this to your own people?" David Sanchez was a particularly interesting case. And you'll see that because I've got 3 slides here that we're going to go through. But he literally was asked to use his body, his ethnic brown body, to pose as a quote unquote illegal. I also did undercover work, posing as an illegal, when they had information on a lumber company. They had information that false documents were being sold so they could go to work. They even had housing inside, so they wouldn't be able to go to rent a house or an apartment or whatever. They had housing inside the building. And of course, they would deduct it from their checks, you know, of course, that's what they do. So the agency wanted to know what type of documentation that it was being sold right there and by who and everything. So they had 2 candidates, another Latino agent, Cortez, let's say, and myself, that would more or less fit in as an illegal. So I went up there and I said, okay, fine. And the supervisor said, okay, don't shave through the weekend, let your hair grow, okay? Don't be out there real clean shaven. I went there with jeans, tenis, and a t-shirt and baseball cap. I mean, I get in there and I said, I'm looking for a job. He said, well, there are openings. I said, well, but I don't have no documentation, everything in Spanish, okay? He said, don't worry about it. We can hook you up with a social security and everything. That's all you need. Just in 3 hours, I got me a job, I got me a social security number, and I got me a place to live. I said, well, let me go back to my apartment. I'm staying with a friend. I can get my stuff. And he said, okay, fine. And I left walking. So I started walking and walking. I saw the car of the special agents and they just followed me. Once we got far away enough from the lumber yard, they said, okay, hop in. I said, yes, sir. He said, did you get it? I said, yeah, this is my social security number. And they got housing inside. He said, did you see any people? I said, yeah, I saw at least 20 to 25 people. He said, okay, fine, that's all we need. He said, but you won't be able to participate when we come in and raid the place because we don't want them to know you or see you. So they hit the place and got 160 illegals in there. Just as an aside, this was fascinating to listen to, I followed up. I don't have it on the slides here, but I followed up and I said, did they press charges on the lumber company? He's like, you're damn right, we did. And I said, and what happened to the 160 people they brought out? He's like, I don't know. He couldn't tell me what happened to him. He said, probably got deported. Even though some of them were brought onto the case to actually testify against the lumber yard, the lumber company. But there's this weird element of almost kind of shaking loose, compartmentalizing the realities of the violence that he's perpetrating with his body. And more agents spoke to this specifically about who they are and how that, who they are on the outside and how that could be weaponized. Gerardo Fuentes said it's like that saying in Spanish, cuando quieres cachar un coyote, manda un coyote, or something like that. Luis Robles said the same thing. Who else would do it better when you know your raza? Anthony Garza spoke to this as well. He said, oh, of course, the language barrier. It's difficult for somebody who doesn't know the language to get the point across when you're trying to break people or trying to arrest people, and being Hispanic is a big plus. The language barrier, hands down. This feels like a track back to the language element of it, which I would say, again, is an outward expression of ethnic identity. Doesn't necessarily entail psychological self-categorization. But this is a turn at this point in these conversations where it's explicitly discussed as a weapon, right? The language here and being Hispanic is used when they're trying to break people. I'm sorry to say, but it gets worse. Tomas Pedraza talked about being involved with some protest groups. And when I asked, wait, what do you mean? He said, in the intel, all these groups, nonprofit organizations, were actually stirring up detainee protests, so we got involved. I took pictures of each one of them. In other words, I gathered intelligence of where they hung out and everything, wrote up everything. I stood there next to them when they were protesting and everything. I just blend in to find out what's actually going on. In this case, and others like it, another agent talked about walking right out of the building, right out of the detention center, and blending into a crowd of protesters. Are talking, they're talking about their bodies literally allowing them to walk into a protest group, which in places like where they are predominantly Latino themselves. And of course, it's not about service provision, not about being a responsive and representative bureaucracy. It's about tactical advantage. It's about serving the agency's broader goals. Melissa Morales spoke to this as well. She said, me being in fugitive operations, you kind of put your mindset on how to locate these people. You kind of know how the family diversity works, how, it's just like little cultural stuff that allows her to track people. Alfredo Ibanez was a particularly striking case because while some of these agents talked about the tactical advantage provided to them by their outward expressions of ethnic identity, their skin tone, the way they looked, the way they talked, nobody was as boastful about it as Alfredo. He said, what makes me very effective is my language skills, my familiar face to the majority of the people that we're targeting. That's an advantage to me. I've noticed that with me, they're not, I've heard of other places that you knock on the door and they don't even open it. But here, we don't have that problem. They come out, they talk to me and give me information. There's a different, face that they're looking at, a face they recognize. Sorry, this isn't a quote. This is a quote out of the manuscript. I shouldn't have quoted it like that. But when I asked him to elaborate, he was prepared with a stunning example. Contrasting himself with a fellow agent he referred to as the Hammer, a 6'5" tattooed white agent, Alfredo described the different responses each of them received when they approached the home of a potential target. When it was the Hammer who knocked on the door, Alfredo explained, the inhabitants were less likely to open it. They'd be like, oh shit, something's going on, he said, mimicking the motions of someone looking through the window shades while trying to avoid being seen. But when Alfredo knocked, the agent claimed in a boastful tone things were different. When targets saw his face as opposed to the Hammer's, they opened their doors and graciously welcomed him inside, saying, ah, sí, pásale, mijo. All right, so analysis of the interview data that I've shared with you, these few excerpts, reveal that while the focus on identity as psychology is important, it obscures the role of physical identity, descent-based attributes. Focusing on agents' brown bodies allows us to see that the role of identity plays out in parallel processes. And the result is a double violence. Violence against the Latino migrants whose trust is violated by agents who look and talk like they do, and violence against the Latino agents whose bodies are essentially co-opted in service of the state. Why? Because where the state can't co-opt the minds of all of its Latino agents, it co-opts their bodies and weaponizes them against the communities it targets, and in many cases, communities agents call home. So what do we do with this? One of the defining characteristics of the state is given to us by Max Weber is the monopoly on legitimate use of force. And Siegel actually teaches us that as violence workers, or that violence workers themselves actually create the state at the same time that they're part of it, right? By serving as that mechanism of violence. As violence workers, Latino agents are simultaneously becoming and creating the state. By focusing on who these people are, who the state actually recruits into these positions, and how their identities are leveraged for the purposes of migration control, sheds further light on migration control efforts and border militarization. And ultimately, what's done in our name. Thank you so much. I appreciate all questions and comments, and suggestions are of course welcome. My email is on the screen. You can follow me at _fronteras_ on Twitter, and my website is there too. Thank you so much.
David, thank you for this presentation. My chest is tight, I'm going to be honest.
Oh no.
No, this is important work. So I'm just going to start off with like a few reflections that I have, and I encourage everyone while I'm reflecting for you to type in your questions in the Q&A. I will then read the questions directly from the Q&A chat box, and then David will take them one by one. I want to underscore just a few things that I really appreciate about your work. One is that, you know, your project really is about state violence, and state violence in action really is the study of the bureaucracy. And so I think as a fellow bureaucracy scholar, I know this is difficult work, but again, I think this just further, I hope, shows everyone who's listening here why it is important to study the bureaucracy, why it is important to ask questions about what is happening internally, and then maybe to follow up with questions of accountability and oversight, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think one of the big questions that I was wondering about this talk coming in before I saw your empirics was this question of diversity, right? We're in a moment when diversity is at the agenda of a lot of different organizations and agencies, but really your work, you know, asks us to pause and really asks us seriously to think about what is diversity getting us, right? And so really, one question that I think we all come away with is, when does diversity change the work of the agency and the organization to reduce state violence, versus when does more diversity actually enhance or reproduce state violence? And it doesn't have to just be state violence, but this can be for any organization right now currently with diversity on their minds. As a fellow bureaucracy scholar, again, maybe you can reflect more about this later, but really, I wondered if this was just, you know, one of those classic stories of there's a mission that the organization has, there's a task, you know, the mission here is reduce undocumented, you know, the presence of undocumented immigrants. The task of these agents is therefore arrest, and therefore the agent just goes and does it. But, you know, we also know that there are stories of discretion and resistance. And so absolutely. I was really hoping that you would, you know, maybe have the empirics there. Maybe you didn't share them, maybe you didn't find them. I think either way, I was really curious, do you document efforts, resistance from the agents to either change the work in action or change the work of the organization itself, to reframe it, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So that was a lot. Maybe you can just reflect on.
No worries. Thank you, Angie, again for the invitation. As I got through it, I was like, okay, so maybe this does make sense to me, which is maybe not a good sign, right? Like that I'm showing up and presenting work that maybe I'm not entirely convinced by yet. But there's something here. There's something interesting to me in this kind of narrative that I've got going. But I was actually struck when I began this work, right, by how much resistance there was. And in the book project, that's where a lot of the focus is. As I mentioned, in kind of positioning myself as among those scholars who's arguing that Latino agents, ethnic identities and their commitment to those identities, right, like as social identities, from the psychological perspective, that those things actually shape the way that they engage with migrants, the way that they approach the job. There are a lot of agents who struggle on a daily basis. And the argument that I'm making in the book is that liminality, right, and the wrestling of these identities is a day-to-day process, is a lived experience, not just a kind of social or a theoretical construct, right? Liminality, we use that word a lot. But I'm actually showing in the book project like what that looks like in the daily lives of people who struggle to kind of negotiate the space between who they are and what they do, right? Because they're still trying to maintain both, right? They want to maintain both. And given the fact that social identity theory, social psychology tells us that identities, psychological as they are meant to help clarify the world for us, right? They're meant to make things easier for us to process. That's not what's actually happening for a lot of these agents. What I close the book with is that unfortunately, I don't have a rosy picture to paint. And that institutional socialization, institutional structures, the way that performance is measured, not to mention, what agents describe as kind of watchful eyes on the part of their non-Latino peers, significantly constrains the extent to which they can exercise discretion in ways that are ameliorating of that tension. So a lot of agents ultimately find ways of opting into units where they can mitigate that tension, like kind of artificially, right? I'm gonna opt into a unit where I'm not dealing with families and where I don't see those kids, where I don't see like how tough this is, like what it is that I'm doing and breaking up families. Like they would literally say that, right? So I'm gonna opt into the unit that does criminal prosecutions, where I can reasonably convince myself that the people that I'm dealing with here are bad people and they're not me, right? That's the important distinction for a lot of them, is that like, well, over here, those aren't my people. My people are people who, yes, are Latino and obey the law. There's actually some wiggle room there when it comes to administrative law, because they draw distinctions between people who come here. I have an agent in the book who talks about, when I asked her, what were the circumstances of this guy that you're talking to me about, of his arrival in the United States? And she's like, that's irrelevant. I don't care if somebody comes here illegally. What I care is what they do once they're here, right? And so she uses that as a way to kind of deflect from the fact that she might be doing terrible things in another unit, or things that kind of put her in tension with the job. And over here, she's able to kind of just put blinders on, right? And distract. Other agents talk about moving in the opposite direction. I don't like being out there knocking down doors when we pull a guy out of his, well, not pull a guy out of his house, when we arrest a guy, put cuffs on a guy outside of his house. I see the children crying. I hear the wife or the husband crying, whatever. And so I'm going to go over here and work in a alternatives to detention unit, where I can tell myself, I'm not out there breaking up families. I'm over here trying to help people adjudicate their cases with ICE. I'm over here trying to make sure that people stay, in good standing with ICE while they go through the appeals process, and feel like they're doing a service, right? And so the way that I've talked about this before is that ultimately what happens is what Celeste Watkins Hayes refers to as kind of the creation of a new identity, right? It's not, they're no longer Latino and an immigration agent. They're both, right? Mm-hmm. Simultaneously. And they build these kind of working identities where they're now a Latino immigration agent, as opposed to a Latino and immigration agent. So, but the rosy picture is not there, unfortunately.
So actually, in your reflection or your response to my question, I think you touched on some of what our participants here are curious to learn more about. So do want to be conscious of time. We have about 10 minutes. And so I'm going to—
Oh, goodness.
Yeah, we have 6 questions currently. So I think I'll read the first 3, which I think are a little bit related, and then we'll move on to another set. So maybe oh, we have 7 now. Okay, so this is great. So can you also see, David, the questions on your screen?
Oh,
I can read them out loud.
On them and open them. Oh, there you are.
Right. So
there they are.
Yeah, I can go ahead and read them for you. So Angel Molina is asking, thank you for the illuminating presentation and for your incredibly important work, David. You've given a lot to think about. I'm wondering if any of the border agents you interviewed, especially those who are from border communities themselves, expressed any concern for or interest in how they are perceived by other members of the community. And relatedly, Rachel Misserlian asks, do you think there is or notice any difference between first, second, third generation Latino Americans and their ability to do this work without feeling like they are, hurting, quote, their own people? And then Mateo Vidal asks, did you see any examples of self-reflection among the Latino border agents while recounting our work, their work? So maybe let's spend 3 minutes on this and then go to the second set of questions.
Yeah, I tend to ramble, and I'm sorry. You and I could talk about bureaucracy forever because I wanted to bring up Michael Lipsky and stuff, but we can put that off. So perceptions in the community. A lot of the Latino agents talked about hiding what they do, not talking to people about what they do, and in some cases even telling people, I work for Coca-Cola. That agent explicitly saying, who doesn't love Coca-Cola? Or other people telling other people, excuse me, that, well, I work with the government. I work with the federal government. The thing is, though, in communities like South Texas and the Rio Grande Valley, it's kind of hard to hide some of the things that you do. So people, across all 3 states really talked about encounters with people outside of work, right? Be it at church, be it at the grocery store, be it while getting into their car, at different places if they were wearing their flak jacket or things like that. And what I make it a point to say actually in the book manuscript is that there's maybe a tendency, again, in keeping with the argument in this paper, to think about the tensions that arise out of being Latino and immigration agent as exclusively internal, and not also kind of bolstered and reinforced by external pressures from members of the community, family members, and things like that, is an oversight, right? It would be wrong not to think of those as also kind of contributing to that internal tension. And it is something that I do see a lot, or I did see a lot in the field work, and is part of the broader book project. Generations is the role of generational status is actually rather interesting. What I find, and so thank you for that question, what I find most fascinating, and is kind of the most powerful moderating variable, if you will. I don't like to talk about variables as much because we're talking about qualitative work, but what I see most in the agents who feel the most pressure is, regardless of citizenship status, right, or not citizenship status, excuse me, generation, they could be, first, second, or third, or more than that. Those agents who actually were familiar with their own family's immigration histories and could see themselves as a separate point on the same pathway with the people that they were encountering, obviously through the lens of Latino and ethnic identity, were those that were more likely to express concern, express sympathy, talk about how they approach their jobs in different ways that was outside of the norm of expectations. And that tracked across all generation groups, it just depended on the extent to which they were connected and still saw themselves as almost living out an extended or kind of protracted version of the immigrant story. Self-reflection, yes, it happens a lot. Some of the things that Francisco Cantu wrote about in his book, When the Line Becomes a River, grinding his teeth out, having kind of physical manifestations of stress. I also document. Again, I want to be careful about how far I push this, because there is a tendency, I think, within my work to be read as overselling the extent to which people are self-reflective or feel bad about what they do. And I want to put out there that I don't mean to remove the agency from these individual Latino agents either. They are still, regardless of economic circumstance, regardless of what kind of positions they're in, regardless of if they feel bad or not about the fact that their bodies communicate particular things to their clientele that maybe they don't want to be seen as betraying trust, they are still making the conscious decision to continue being a part of it. And that is where notions of self-reflection and guilt and physical manifestations of stress start to ring hollow, even for me, someone who spent a lot of time with these people and got to know them in a way that did humanize them for me in a lot of ways. Thanks so much.
Thank you. So I know it's Friday, but your topic is so incredibly important and nuanced. And so I want us to get through all these questions. And so
yes.
I'm going to read another batch. And I hope that for those of you who can, maybe we can extend it just 5 more minutes. I'll set my timer. Yeah. I'll cut us off at 2:05.
I definitely can. And of course, I'm happy to take emails,
yes,
whatever.
Okay, so the next question comes from Daniel Vargas, and he says, I have been in both sides of the border. I immigrated in the 1980s to the US from Mexico. And in my dealings at the border and at the INS experience, a more tough questioning by Latinx agents. Later, I volunteered from 2014 to 2017 at a detention center doing cultural activities with the immigrant youth from Central America and Mexico. It was a different approach I took after being involved my Latinx, Chicana communities and Mexican American studies. I earned the youth immigrants' trust, mind and heart by being more consistent or conscient on why they are coming here and what they left in their home countries and what they want to achieve here. Pam Delargy says, what a marvelous presentation. You made a very complex issue clear and horrifying too. Thank you. Given the great diversity of people arriving at the borders, including African, South Asians, I'm curious whether border authorities have tried to recruit other agents of other backgrounds, so African Americans, Asian Americans, for example, to play similar roles with these groups. Really important, interesting, important question. Celeste Ceja asks, it seems to me that that this is a taboo topic for Hispanic communities. Absolutely right, because we are a very community-oriented group. It's hard to process that there are people who do not identify with the communities that raised them or raise their parents. And then you go as far back to also terrorize them. It's a weird pattern of 3rd, 4th generation assimilation. And then I'll bring in here James Story, who says, do you have ideas for what you might be researching in 20 years? I think you have definitely made a great case about how brown bodies are being weaponized. And I look forward to hearing more about you going forward. So we'll stop there, and then we have 3 more questions. So maybe 2 to 3 minutes on this batch.
Okay. Oh my God. Daniel Vargas, thank you for sharing that. I find it fascinating. I don't have a lot to offer outside of recognizing, right, that there's a lot of moving pieces in all of these places. Even the agents themselves would talk about contract workers and contract detention facility workers as another kind of element, another added element. The case of Latino customs agents at the border being harder on raza, so to speak, than others, I hear it a lot, and it's something that oddly enough I hear from the non-Latino agents about the Latino agents. So what I highlight in the book is actually a fair amount of code switching, right, on the part of Latino agents when they're in the presence of non-Latino agents, or Latino agents that they feel like maybe they can't trust, to the extent where they're trying to make sure they don't appear too close to the migrants that they're dealing with, right? So the same way that Ice Cube and NWA sing about, Black cops trying to show up for the white cops, I think that's what may be going on. But at the same time, I can't discount the kind of animosity that we've seen, or the animus that exists between, native-born Latinos in the U.S. side with immigrants, or even people crossing the border, which I remember, in South Texas being referred to as Mexican nationals, and kind of the connotation that came with that. Diversity of the workforce, given the diversity of immigrants themselves, have I noticed a demographic shift? I haven't actually. Then again, in the last couple years of the Trump administration, the agency and all of my kind of contacts within it really clammed up. I'm hopeful that in the coming years, maybe things loosen up a little bit more and I can get access to some of the data that I was being fed from internal statisticians. But at this point, I couldn't answer that with any certainty. Community and terror. I feel you, Celeste. This is taboo. This is oddly enough, though, we don't really have really firm public opinion data among Latinos with respect to their attitudes about Latinos being in these positions. Some of my previous work on this, a PRQ piece I had come out this last year, highlights some of the Latino agents talk about, wanting to make a difference, wanting to, like, if we're not ourselves in positions of authority, if we're not actually, this agent said, in the chicken coop, then who's going to look out for our people, right? So there's that kind of almost like a turning upside down of the notion of it being a taboo, right? And trying to get in and change the institution from the inside, which we know is, and at least I argue in the book, is a futile effort. The only way we're going to change the agency is by abolishing it. And so I'll just say that, abolish ICE. In 20 years, good God. I hope that I'm still a professor. I hope that I can get tenure. My trajectory, I think, in research is leading me towards gender research in masculinity specifically. And I think that's kind of born out of what I saw in this project, in kind of manifestations of masculinity, of course, not just within men, but in women as well. Thank you.
Wow, David, thank you. I also want to see you move into work on masculinity, and so we have three more. I want to make sure I read them, and I want to make sure we spend at least a couple minutes on them. So Fabian Nuner asks, or says, great question from Angel. I was wondering something similar in terms of whether you saw any evidence of underlying linked fate as an important factor. And then we have two anonymous attendees who have posted two comments. So the first is that I'm from Nogales, Arizona. All through high school, we had agents come to our school, and persuade us to join and have a career with them instead of going to college. Whoever posted this, I'm from Lockhart, Texas, same thing. Our community of Nogales is a mostly Hispanic community. Do you think that this is part of the problem, that they try to recruit from these communities and that Border Patrol is able to show up to public schools and create programs and offer an alternative to college? And then relatedly, additionally, do you feel like this is exploiting Hispanic men and women, especially first gens, when they feel like they need a steady career where they can have a decent salary and college is unattainable? So these are thinking about pipelines into the profession.
Yeah. So Fabian, hi. Linked fate is a difficult concept, I would say, probably to nail down in this medium, right? But I did see glimmers of it, right? Even among the agents who would talk, I would ask them about, is it difficult if you're, because the majority of the agents I'm talking about here are, Mexican heritage, right? Ask them if it was difficult or if they felt differently about Central American migrants, right, when they encountered those. And I was struck, I remember, by agents talking about, well, yeah, they might not be Mexican, but we always have Spanish. That brings us together, right? Or other agents talking about, his own understanding of other national origin kind of culture, right? And vas a llegar a las pupusas, for certain immigrants and stuff, and talking about food from particular countries and stuff. And he said he tried to connect with them in those ways, right, by acknowledging some sort of shared identity. To the anonymous poster about high school recruitment, is this part of the problem? Yes, plain and simple. Yes. Is this exploitation? So the last two people I would please ask, if please ask you to read the PRQ piece that I had come out this last year. If you can't access it because it's behind a paywall, I am happy to provide it to you. So send me an email. I'd be happy to share it with you. It is addressing this very thing, right? I know I mentioned that Latinos who go into this line of work do have other options. I think I kind of firmly put myself in that camp when I called publicly on Latinos in immigration law enforcement to quit out of in protest of the Trump administration's child separation policies, zero tolerance, in the Washington Post last year, or 2019, sorry. But at the same time, I think it's hard to see what I've shared with you all today and the kind of weaponization of their bodies and their outward expressions of identity, right? And the recruitment that goes into it. And there is a quote that I could share with you all today that is in line with this manuscript. That one of the agents told me, he's like, this isn't about like increasing diversity for diversity's sake. This isn't about like, oh, we want a more representative agency. This is about what skills can they bring to the table to help us further our goal. And that is the language. That is their connection with the people that we're targeting, right? There is something inherently exploitative about going to these communities and recruiting in them when you know that you may be one of only 2 or 3 other major sources of employment and economic and occupational mobility. Thanks so much.
Thank you, David. So I was just posting in the chat the link to the article that you referenced, and I hope it's okay to say to please email you for a copy.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you, everyone, all 17 of you who are still with us here. I also just wanted to pause and say this work is traumatic. This is qualitative research. This is really rigorous, important, meaningful research, and it's also I'm sure, I don't know if everyone is having physical reactions and my chest is tight, and so I think this also just speaks to the hard work of doing this really immersive ethnographic qualitative research. And second, I also wanted to say I hope that all of your families are safe. It's a pandemic, and if you have family members, loved ones who are currently in Texas or other regions that are experiencing power outages or broken pipes, busted pipes, we are thinking of you. And this is a really isolating and dark time, but I'm happy to be still here in community with you all. And thank you for those of you who commented. And yeah, stay safe, and please be on the lookout for David's upcoming book. Thank you. Have a safe weekend.
Thank you so much.